The grand empire of the Zelthari stretched across the stars, its people known for their wisdom, power, and beauty. For thousands of years, the royal family ruled with strength, and their children were always blessed with perfect sight, sharp minds, and strong bodies. But when Princess Valith was born, everything changed. She was blind. The moment her parents saw her colorless eyes, fear spread through the palace. Among the Zelthari, sight was considered the most important sense. They believed their rulers must see everything, both the visible world and the paths of destiny. A blind princess was unheard of. Whispers filled the great halls, and soon the people called her the Cursed One. Even though she was a princess, no one wanted her. Her father, Emperor Xelfar, tried to hide his disappointment. He still loved his daughter, but deep inside, he knew she was a problem. If she could not see, how could she rule? How could she lead armies, read the stars, or choose a worthy husband? As the years passed, Valith grew into a graceful and intelligent woman. She learned to use her other senses to understand the world. She could hear a person's heartbeat and tell if they were lying. She could walk through the palace without ever hitting a wall. But no matter how much she proved herself, the nobles still looked at her with pity or disgust. And worst of all, no one wanted to marry her. The empire needed strong alliances, and royal marriages were the best way to secure them. But every prince, warlord, and noble who came to Zelthar rejected her. They gave polite excuses, but Valith knew the truth. They saw her as useless, weak, and broken. Her father grew desperate. He begged the rulers of other planets, offering wealth, power, even rare treasures, but still no one accepted her hand. The shame was unbearable. Even her younger sister, born years later, had already received 3 marriage proposals. One evening, Valith sat alone in the palace garden, her fingers brushing over the soft petals of a rare moonflower. She didn't need eyes to know it was beautiful. Its scent, its delicate touch, the way it moved in the breeze. She understood beauty in ways others never could. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She recognized them immediately, her father's slow, heavy steps, filled with worry. "You sit here alone again, my daughter," the emperor said, his deep voice carrying sadness. Valith turned her head slightly. "Alone is better than being surrounded by people who see me as nothing." The emperor sighed and sat beside her. "That is not true. You are more than they will ever understand. But the world does not see with the heart, only with the eyes." Valith smiled bitterly. "And I have no eyes, so to them, I am nothing." There was a long silence. Then the emperor spoke the words she dreaded. "We have only one option left. The Terrans, humans, have recently entered the galactic stage. They are new, but they are bold. Their leader, a man named Captain Elias Carter, is coming for negotiations. He is unmarried." Valith froze. A human. The strange, unpredictable race that had shocked the galaxy with their rapid growth. She had heard stories of them. Wild, stubborn, fearless. Unlike other species, they did not care about old traditions. They followed their own rules. "You want me to marry a human?" she asked, surprised. The emperor hesitated. "He may refuse, like the others, but I must try." For the first time in a long while, Valith felt a spark of curiosity. Every suitor before had rejected her because they were afraid of her blindness. But humans were different. Maybe, just maybe, this one would see her for more than what she lacked. She turned her face toward the night sky, even though she could not see the stars. A small smile formed on her lips. "Let him come," she whispered. The grand halls of the Zelthari palace were filled with tension. Today was the day Captain Elias Carter, a human diplomat, would arrive. The nobles whispered among themselves, their expressions filled with doubt and curiosity. Why would a human agree to this proposal? Did he not know that the princess was blind? Princess Valith sat quietly on her throne, her hands resting in her lap. She could not see the palace's golden walls, the massive crystal pillars, or the swirling galaxies painted on the ceiling. But she could hear the way the nobles moved, hesitant, uncertain. She could feel their doubt in the way the room's energy shifted. Her father, Emperor Xelfar, sat beside her. He looked strong as always, but she could tell from the way he gripped his staff that he was anxious. The great doors opened with a deep echo. Heavy boots stepped forward, strong, steady, and confident, even before the couriers announced his name. Valeth knew this was the human, Captain Elias Carter. His footsteps were different from those of the Zelthari. He did not glide smoothly like her people. Instead, his steps had purpose, like a man who had walked across many worlds, through danger and adventure. The room fell silent. Valeth heard the sharp intake of breath from the nobles. What did he look like? She knew humans had no scales, no horns, and no luminous eyes like her people. Instead, they were made of soft skin, with hair that grew on their heads in different shades. Their bodies were weaker than most species, but their willpower was legendary. She listened carefully as he walked closer, stopping only a few feet away. Then he spoke. "Your Highness." His voice was deep but warm, filled with respect but not fear. "I am Captain Elias Carter of the Terran Union. It is an honor to stand before you." Valeth tilted her head slightly. She had expected hesitation, maybe even discomfort, but there was none in his voice. The Emperor spoke first. "Captain Carter, you know why we have called you here." His voice was formal, but there was a hidden plea beneath his words. "I do." Elias did not hesitate. "You seek a suitor for your daughter." A murmur spread through the hall. No one had expected him to say it so plainly. Most suitors spoke in flowery words, pretending they were here for diplomacy rather than a marriage offer. Valeth turned her face toward him. "And what do you think of this?" she asked. Elias paused for a moment, then said something that shocked the entire court. "I think your people are fools." Gasps filled the room. The nobles stiffened in anger, but Valeth only raised an eyebrow. She had not expected this. Her father's voice was sharp. "Explain yourself, Captain." Elias's tone did not change. "Your Highness, your daughter is called the Cursed One because she is blind. But from what I have learned, she is intelligent, wise, and possesses a strong spirit. Where I come from, that is what makes a person valuable, not just their sight." Silence. Valeth felt a strange emotion rise inside her, something she had never felt with any other suitor. Was this respect? Elias continued. "I have traveled many worlds, met many species. Some see with their eyes, some with their minds, some with their hearts. Yet your people, who claim to be one of the greatest empires in the galaxy, reject a woman who has more strength than all of you combined." He paused, then said firmly, "That is foolish." The room was filled with stunned whispers. No one had ever spoken to the Zelthari nobility this way. Valeth's lips curled into a small smile. "And do you consider yourself wiser than the great Zelthari Empire, Captain?" Elias chuckled. "Not wiser, just less blind." For the first time in her life, Valeth laughed. A real, genuine laugh. It startled everyone, even her father. The Emperor studied Elias for a long moment. Then he asked, "Are you saying that you would accept this proposal?" Elias was silent for a moment. Valeth waited, curious, hopeful, afraid. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. "I would." The room erupted into chaos. Some nobles shouted in protest, calling it an insult. Others whispered in shock, wondering if the human had lost his mind. But Valeth did not care about them. She only cared about one thing. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen her, not out of duty, not out of pity, but because they saw her true worth. And that, she realized, was the most powerful thing of all. The news of Captain Elias Carter's acceptance spread through the Zelthari Empire like wildfire. No one had expected a human, a species so new to the galactic stage, to agree to marry the so-called cursed princess. The royal court was in an uproar. Some nobles believed this was an insult to their traditions. Others whispered that it was a desperate move to avoid embarrassment. But amidst all the chaos, Valeth sat in silence, her mind filled with thoughts she had never dared to entertain before. She had spent years being rejected. She had listened to the murmurs of pity, felt the cold distance of people who did not believe she could be anything more than a burden. And yet, in one simple moment, a human had shattered those beliefs. Valeth had met many suitors before. All of them had hidden their discomfort, pretending to be polite while secretly searching for an excuse to leave. But Elias Carter had not done that. He had stood before the court and called them blind, as if her people were the ones who could not see. Now, as she sat in the royal garden, she could hear the distant arguments of the nobles, their voices filled with anger and disbelief. The empire was shaken, and everything was about to change. A dangerous meeting. "This is unacceptable," a noble shouted. The council chamber was filled with high-ranking officials, all gathered before Emperor Xelfar. Many of them had served the empire for decades, their loyalty unquestionable, but their pride was another matter. "The princess deserves a true warrior," another noble declared. "Not some outsider from a primitive species." Elias sat beside the emperor, arms crossed, completely calm. He had expected resistance. He knew how alien politics worked. Powerful people hated change. He leaned forward. "You doubt my ability?" he asked, his tone casual. A Zelthari general narrowed his glowing yellow eyes. "You are human. You are weaker than us. Your technology is young. Your history is short. Why should we accept you as a future ruler?" Elias smirked. "Because I did something none of you did." The room fell silent. "I accepted Princess Valeth for who she is," he continued. "You, her own people, spent years treating her like a curse. You see blindness as a weakness, but where I come from, we see struggle as strength." His voice grew sharper. "Tell me, how many of you would survive if you lost your sight today? How many of you could walk these halls without a guide? Sense a lyre from their heartbeat. Feel the wind shift before a storm even begins." No one spoke. Elias's smirk faded, and his tone became serious. "Valeth has done that her whole life, and still she stands tall while you all whisper behind her back." He looked around the room. "You think I am unworthy? Maybe. But I promise you this, I see more worth in her than any of you ever have." The emperor watched the room carefully. Some nobles looked ashamed, others still furious. But one thing was clear. Elias Carter was not backing down. At last, the emperor spoke. "The decision has been made. The wedding will proceed." His voice was final, allowing no argument. The nobles had no choice but to bow. But as Elias glanced across the room, he saw the silent glares of those who were not ready to accept this union. Not everyone would let this happen peacefully. Valeth's doubt. That night, Valeth walked through the palace, her steps quiet against the marble floor. The scent of midnight flowers filled the air, mixing with the cool breeze that drifted through the open corridors. She did not need her eyes to know that Elias was standing nearby. His footsteps were different from the others. Not too soft, not too heavy. Always steady. "You speak like a warrior," she said, stopping beside him. "But do you truly believe what you said today?" Elias turned toward her. "Every word." She hesitated. "Even if the whole empire stands against you?" He chuckled. "I've had worse odds." Valeth tilted her head. "You are strange. I get that a lot." She smiled, but her mind was still clouded with doubt. "I have spent my whole life being unwanted. I never thought someone would choose me." Elias's voice softened. "Then maybe your people were wrong about more than just me." Valeth didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. For the first time in her life, someone stood beside her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was unfamiliar. It was terrifying. And yet, for the first time, she did not feel alone. Shadows in the dark. Far away from the palace, a secret meeting was taking place. A group of masked figures sat in the darkness, their voices low and filled with rage. "The Emperor has made a mistake," one of them hissed. "We cannot let a human into our royal bloodline. The people will never accept it," another whispered. The leader leaned forward, his eyes glowing like burning embers. "Then we must ensure the wedding never happens." Silence filled the room. Then, slowly, they nodded. The assassination plan had begun. The palace was quieter than usual. Whispers of discontent had spread like a poisonous mist, reaching even the lowest servants. A human was to marry their princess, a future emperor from a species they barely knew. Some accepted it as fate. Others saw it as an insult to their traditions. But in the dark corners of the empire, there were those who would not accept it at all. A silent warning. Late at night, Valeth sat on the balcony of her chamber, her face turned toward the endless sky. She could not see the stars, but she could feel the wind shift, hear the faint hum of distant ships, and sense the tension in the air. Something was wrong. She had felt it all day, the change in the palace atmosphere, the uneasy movements of the guards, the hurried whispers in the corridors. A soft rustle behind her made her stiffen. She did not turn, but her fingers subtly reached for the small dagger hidden in her sleeve. "Who's there?" she asked calmly. A pause. Then a voice she recognized. "It's me." Zaina, her childhood handmaiden. Valeth relaxed slightly, but she could still hear the nervousness in Zaina's breathing. She was afraid. Zaina stepped closer. "My lady, forgive me, but I must speak." "Then speak." Zaina hesitated, then said in a whisper, "They are planning to kill him." Valeth's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Zaina swallowed. "The nobles, the old houses, they see this marriage as an insult. They won't let a human take the throne. They will act before the wedding." Valeth tightened her grip on the balcony railing. She had expected anger from the nobles, but murder. Fools, blind, arrogant fools. She turned to Zaina. "Do you know when?" Zaina shook her head. "No, but soon." She hesitated again, then whispered, "They have spies in the palace." Valeth's heart pounded. She had known betrayal before. She had lived with it her whole life in the form of silent rejection, whispered insults, and cold stares. But this was different. This was a declaration of war. Elias's decision. In the palace's training grounds, Captain Elias Carter was not asleep. While the rest of the court was in turmoil, he had been preparing. A lifetime in the Terran military had taught him one thing: expect betrayal before it arrives. Now, standing in the dimly lit courtyard, he ran through combat drills. His body moved in sharp, controlled motions, muscles tensed, sweat glistening under the pale moonlight. The energy blade in his hand hummed softly as he practiced. He knew he was being watched. He had felt the eyes on him all day. Suspicious glances, cautious whispers, movements that seemed just a little too careful. They didn't want him here. Some out of prejudice, some out of fear. But a few wanted him dead. A shadow flickered near one of the stone pillars. Elias didn't react. He simply continued his drills, pretending he hadn't noticed. "Come out," he said casually. Silence. Then a soft step. Valeth. Elias turned to face her. She stood at the edge of the training ground, her long silver hair moving slightly in the breeze. She looked calm, but he could feel the tension in her posture. "I hear you're making enemies," she said. Elias smirked. That was always going to happen. Valeth stepped closer, her voice dropping lower. "You're in danger, Elias. The nobles will try to stop this wedding, with blood if necessary." Elias exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "Yeah, I figured. Some of them have been watching me like I stole their favorite ship." She frowned. "You're not worried?" He shrugged. "Worried? No. But I'm not stupid either." He sheathed his blade. They're making a mistake if they think I'm an easy target. Valeth hesitated, then spoke carefully. You could leave. Elias raised an eyebrow. Is that what you want? She shook her head. No. Silence. Then, softer, she added, but I don't want you to die either. Elias studied her, noticing the way she clenched her hands slightly, as if holding back emotions she didn't fully understand yet. Something inside him shifted. He had accepted this marriage for many reasons: diplomacy, curiosity, defiance. But now he realized something else. He didn't just want to protect himself. He wanted to protect her. Elias stepped closer, his voice steady. Then we don't let them win. Valeth tilted her head. And how do we do that? Elias grinned. We make the first move. The first strike. Far across the palace, in the halls where shadows thrived, the conspirators gathered. A noble in golden robes leaned forward, his expression cold. The human must die before the wedding. Another figure nodded. We have assassins ready. We only need the right moment. Then, a third voice interrupted. We may not get one. The others turned. A cloaked figure stood near the doorway, their voice low and urgent. The human is not a fool. He knows something is coming. The golden-robed noble scoffed. What can a single human do against us? The cloaked figure hesitated. Then, with a grim tone, they replied, He is already preparing. And worse, so is the princess. The room fell silent. For the first time, doubt crept into their minds. Perhaps they had underestimated the human after all. The Zeltheri palace was beautiful at night. The golden towers reflected the twin moons, and the air carried the scent of midnight flowers. But beneath this beauty, danger lurked in the shadows. Elias Carter stood on the balcony of his temporary chamber, his sharp eyes scanning the palace grounds. He knew something was coming. The assassins wouldn't wait long. Behind him, the door opened softly. He didn't turn. I was wondering when you'd show up, Princess. Valeth stepped forward, her silver hair glowing under the soft lights. You expected me. Elias smirked. You're the only one I trust here. She came to stand beside him, facing the wind. Then you should listen carefully. The attack will happen soon. The nobles think you are blind to their plans. Elias chuckled. That's ironic, considering they've been blind to you for years. Valeth allowed herself a small smile, but her face turned serious again. We cannot wait for them to strike. We need to act first. Elias leaned against the railing. I was thinking the same thing. Setting the stage. An hour later, Elias and Valeth stood inside a hidden chamber beneath the palace. Only a few trusted guards were present, ones loyal to the emperor, not the scheming nobles. Elias rolled out a holographic map of the palace. They'll attack at night, when most of the guards are either resting or distracted. Smart, but not smart enough. Valeth traced a slender finger along the map. They will likely strike here. She pointed to his chambers, or here. She moved her finger to the garden walkway, a secluded path leading to the palace's back gates, the perfect place for an ambush. Elias nodded. Then we give them what they want. I'll walk that path alone. They'll think they have an easy kill. Valeth frowned. Too dangerous, even for you. Elias grinned. You underestimate me, Princess. She crossed her arms. And you underestimate the Zeltheri assassins. They are not amateurs. Elias placed a hand on his energy pistol. Neither am I. Valeth hesitated. Then she exhaled. Fine, but you won't be alone. Elias raised an eyebrow. You're planning something, aren't you? She smiled. A dangerous smile. Of course. The night of the attack. The palace was quiet. Too quiet. Elias walked through the garden walkway, his steps slow, his senses alert. His hand rested casually on his weapon, but he kept his posture relaxed, as if he was unaware of the eyes watching him from the shadows. Then, a soft shift in the wind. They were here. In an instant, 4 figures in dark armor leaped from the shadows, their blades flashing under the moonlight. Fast, silent, deadly. Elias moved. He ducked under the first strike, his pistol already firing. A red energy blast hit the closest assassin in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The second attacker lunged, swinging a curved blade toward Elias's neck. He twisted his body, the blade slicing just inches from his skin. A kick to the attacker's stomach sent them stumbling backward. But there were 2 more. One of them grabbed Elias's arm, twisting it with brutal strength. His pistol dropped to the ground. The other assassin raised a dagger to finish him off. And then, a flash of silver. Before the dagger could strike, a blade sliced through the air, severing the attacker's wrist. Vaylith. She moved like a phantom, her twin daggers cutting through the darkness. The attacker screamed, stumbling back. Before he could react, she drove a blade into his chest. The last assassin turned to run, but a sharp whistle cut through the air. A second later, a Zelthari royal guard leaped from above, landing directly on the fleeing assassin, pinning him to the ground. Elias pulled free from the last attacker's grip and punched him hard across the jaw, knocking him unconscious. Then, silence. The attack was over. Vaylith straightened, breathing heavily. That was reckless. Elias grinned, wiping a cut on his cheek, but effective. She shook her head, but there was a flicker of admiration in her voice. "You're impossible." Elias shrugged. "And you're terrifying." She smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." The aftermath. The captured assassin knelt before the Emperor, his hands bound in energy restraints. The noble conspirators had not expected their plan to fail so spectacularly. The Emperor's voice was cold as steel. "Who ordered this?" The assassin hesitated, until Vaylith stepped forward, her silver eyes glowing faintly. "Tell the truth," she said softly. Something in her voice made the assassin shiver. He swallowed hard. It was Lord Selmar and the House of Vorthus. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. The Emperor's gaze darkened. "They have betrayed their empire." Elias leaned against a pillar. "So, what happens now?" The Emperor stood. "Now, we send a message. The end of the conspiracy." The next evening, House Selmar and House Vorthus were stripped of their titles. Their leaders were arrested, their assets seized. The message was clear. Betrayal would not be tolerated. The rest of the noble houses fell silent. The resistance against Elias vanished overnight. But even as peace settled over the palace, Elias knew this wasn't over. There were still those who resented him. As he stood beside Vaylith on the palace balcony, she spoke softly. "More will come." Elias smirked. "Let them." She turned toward him, curiosity in her expression. "You truly do not fear them." He looked at her, his voice steady. "I fear losing what matters." She was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. A simple gesture. But in that moment, it meant everything. Elias Carter sat in the warship's command bay, staring at the encrypted transmission on his holoscreen. The discovery from the rebel base had changed everything. Someone inside the royal palace, someone close to the Emperor, was secretly funding the rebels. A traitor. Elias clenched his jaw. He had fought wars before, but betrayal was worse than any battlefield. Rion, his Zelthari soldier, stood beside him. "What is the plan, Captain?" Elias smirked. "Simple. We play their game. Better." Back to the palace. The moment Elias stepped into the throne room, he felt the tension in the air. The nobles, the advisors, the generals, all watched him carefully. But Elias didn't show any emotion. He walked forward with the confidence of a man who knew something they didn't. The Emperor sat on his golden throne, his piercing gaze locked onto Elias. "Your mission was successful." Elias bowed slightly. "Yes, Your Majesty. The rebel stronghold has been destroyed." But he paused for effect, Scanning the room, we found something unexpected. A murmur spread through the nobles. Some shifted uncomfortably. The Emperor narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Elias pulled out a small data chip. He activated the holo display, and a familiar voice filled the room. A recorded transmission from the rebel leader. "The payment has been received. Our allies in the palace will ensure Captain Carter does not return alive." The room fell deathly silent. Elias turned off the recording. Then he smiled, a dangerous smile. "Someone in this room tried to have me killed," he said, his voice calm. "And the rebels were just their pawns." The nobles looked at each other, their faces pale. Elias let the silence stretch before he continued. "But I don't play games where I don't know the rules. So, let's make this simple." He threw the data chip onto the floor. "Whoever is responsible, you have one chance to step forward." No one moved. Then, a single chuckle. A noble at the far end of the room took a slow step forward. Lord Selmar. The same noble who had plotted against Elias before. Elias smirked. "Of course." Selmar folded his hands behind his back, his expression calm. "Clever, Captain Carter. But you made a mistake." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Selmar's smirk widened. "You assumed I was alone." At that moment, chaos erupted. The betrayal unfolds. The throne room doors burst open, and dozens of heavily armed guards stormed inside. Not the Emperor's royal guards, Selmar's private forces. The nobles gasped and stepped back. The coup had begun. Selmar turned to the Emperor, his voice mocking. "Your Majesty, it is time for a new rule. One that does not include humans." Elias moved instantly. He grabbed his energy pistol, firing 3 quick shots. Each one found its mark, dropping the first wave of attackers. The Emperor's guards rushed to defend him, but they were outnumbered. Valeth appeared at Elias's side, 2 curved blades in her hands. "You really attract trouble, don't you?" Elias grinned. "And you love saving me." She rolled her eyes. "Don't get yourself killed." Together, they charged into battle. The fight for the throne. The throne room became a war zone. Elias fought like a man possessed, dodging plasma bolts, taking down enemies with precise shots. The noble rebels had planned a coup, but they hadn't planned for him. Valeth moved like a shadow, her twin blades cutting down traitors before they could react. The Emperor, despite his age, stood firm. He lifted his hand, and his personal guard surrounded him, forming a defensive line. Selmar watched from a distance, his face darkening. "Kill them," he shouted, but Elias was already moving. He saw an opening, a straight path to Selmar. With a roar, Elias charged. The noble barely had time to react before Elias slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. Elias pressed his gun against Selmar's chest. Checkmate. Selmar spat blood, but he laughed. "You think killing me will change anything? The nobles will never accept you. You're just a..." Elias pulled the trigger. A single shot. Selmar's body went limp. The remaining rebels, seeing their leader fall, dropped their weapons. It was over. The aftermath. The palace was quiet again. The traitors had been arrested. The Emperor still sat on his throne, but his expression had changed. He looked at Elias with something new in his gaze. Respect. Valeth stood beside Elias, her arms crossed. That was reckless. Elias shrugged. "Worked, didn't it?" She sighed, then smiled. "You're impossible." The Emperor finally spoke. "Captain Carter." Elias turned to him. "You have saved my empire twice. That is not something I take lightly." The Emperor stood, his robes flowing. "From this day forward, you are not just an ally. You are one of us." The nobles murmured in shock. Elias smirked. "I guess that means I passed your test." The Emperor nodded. "And now, it is time to fulfill your promise." Elias's grin faded slightly. He glanced at Valeth. She looked back at him, her silver eyes unreadable. Elias took a deep breath. Right. The marriage. The Emperor's lips curled into a rare smile. Are you hesitating, Captain? Elias chuckled. No, just thinking. He turned to Valeth. What do you think, Princess? Ready to marry a reckless human? She studied him for a long moment. Then she smirked. As long as you're ready to marry a blind alien princess. Elias laughed. Well, I've handled worse. The Emperor clapped his hands. Then it is settled. The nobles bowed. The rebellion was crushed. And Elias Carter, the human who had once been an outsider, was now part of the empire. Forever. The palace was no longer the same. Since the failed assassination attempt, the air had changed. Fear had crept into the hearts of the nobles, and whispers of rebellion had been replaced by silent obedience. But Elias knew fear did not mean loyalty. Loyalty had to be earned. A sudden summons. Elias stood in the grand hall, staring at the massive doors of the throne room. He had been summoned by the Emperor himself, but something felt off. Valeth stood beside him, her expression unreadable. My father rarely calls someone like this. Be careful what you say. Elias smirked. I always am. She sighed. That's what worries me. Before he could reply, the doors swung open, and the two stepped inside. The Emperor sat on his golden throne, his piercing gaze locked on Elias. Around him stood his royal advisors, all of whom had different expressions: curiosity, doubt, and in some cases, resentment. Captain Elias Carter, the Emperor said, his voice calm but powerful. You have proven yourself strong. Elias gave a respectful nod. I do my best. The Emperor's sharp eyes narrowed. But strength is not enough. Loyalty is what matters. Elias tensed slightly. So that's what this was about. The Emperor leaned forward. The noble houses no longer dare to act against you, but there are still whispers. Some say you fight only for your own survival. Others say you will abandon us when it suits you. Elias's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Valeth took a step forward. Father, that is not true. Elias has risked his life for this empire. The Emperor held up a hand, silencing her. His gaze remained on Elias. Will you swear loyalty to the Zeltheri Empire? Elias exhaled slowly. This was the moment. He had come to this planet as an outsider. He had agreed to this marriage as a strategic alliance, nothing more. But things had changed. Valeth had changed him. And now, standing in front of the Emperor, he realized something. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He wanted to protect this place. He met the Emperor's gaze. I will not swear empty words, Your Majesty, but I will say this. I don't abandon my people. And whether you accept it or not, this empire is starting to feel like mine. A long silence followed. Then, to everyone's surprise, the Emperor smiled. A warrior's answer, he said. Honest, and more valuable than 1,000 false oaths. The tension in the room eased slightly. The advisors exchanged quiet glances, and Valeth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But the Emperor wasn't finished. Words are one thing, Captain, he said. But now, I will test your actions. Elias raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? The Emperor stood, his robes flowing around him like waves of liquid gold. There is a mission, one that only a man like you can complete. The dangerous mission. Elias and Valeth stood in a darkened war room, staring at the holographic display in front of them. A small red dot blinked on the screen. This is a rebel stronghold, Valeth explained. They operate in the outer territories, supplying weapons to the noble houses that still oppose my father. Elias crossed his arms. And you want me to shut it down? Valeth nodded. You and a small strike team. No armies, no politics, just a simple mission. Eliminate the threat before they grow stronger. Elias smirked. Sounds fun. Valeth frowned. This is serious, Elias. The rebels are skilled. And you will be deep in enemy territory. If anything goes wrong, she hesitated. I won't be there to help you. Elias studied her. Her face was calm, but he could hear the worry in her voice. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. Hey, I'll be fine. It's not my first time in a war zone. She didn't move away. Just, don't do anything reckless. Elias grinned. No promises. The infiltration. The night was silent as Elias and his elite strike team approached the rebel outpost. The cold desert wind blew across the rocky terrain, carrying the distant hum of alien insects. Elias crouched behind a boulder, scanning the base through his visor. A dozen guards, automated turrets, and a shielded entrance. One of his soldiers, a Zelthari warrior named Rion, whispered, "How do we get inside?" Elias smirked. "Easy. We knock." Before anyone could question him, he grabbed a plasma grenade and threw it. Boom. The explosion lit up the night, sending the rebel camp into chaos. "Move," Elias shouted, charging forward. The team followed, energy rifles flashing as they took down stunned rebels. Elias dodged behind a crate, firing precision shots that dropped enemy after enemy. A rebel soldier rushed him with a blade, but Elias caught his arm and twisted, sending him crashing into the dirt. The battle was fast and brutal. Within minutes, the rebel forces were either dead or surrendering. Rion approached Elias. "The base is secure. What now?" Elias glanced at the entrance to the command center. "Now we find out who's really behind this." The shocking discovery. Inside the command center, Elias hacked into the rebels' communications. As he scrolled through the files, his expression darkened. Then he saw it. A transmission, sent from inside the royal palace. Someone in the emperor's court had been secretly funding the rebels. Elias clenched his fists. "Looks like we've got a traitor." Rion stepped closer. "What do we do?" Elias smirked. "We go home." He turned off the display. "And we set a trap of our own."